In the spring of 1763, violence erupted in the forests west of the Appalachian Mountains, shattering the fragile peace that had followed the French and Indian War. This conflict, now known as Pontiac's War or Pontiac's Rebellion, arose from the collision of cultures and territorial ambitions, igniting a fierce struggle marked by the resolute determination of those fighting to protect their ancestral lands. As Great Britain sought to solidify its dominance following the 7 Years' War, native tribes, led by the indomitable Pontiac, stood unwavering, challenging the imperial might. In this gripping narrative of conflict, the Great Lakes transformed into a battleground where survival and sovereignty teetered on the edge. What stories of bravery and sacrifice emerged amid the clash of empires? How did Pontiac's visionary leadership shape the course of native resistance against the relentless tide of British expansion? Stick around as we delve deep into the intricacies of the Pontiac War, exploring its origins and the factors that ultimately led to its conclusion. As you engage with this video, please hit the like button, subscribe, and activate the notification bell to stay updated. Thank you for being with us again. The seeds of unrest that culminated in Pontiac's rebellion were sown long before the French and Indian War, but the uprising was directly fueled by the British treatment of native peoples between the capture of Fort Niagara in 1759 and the spring of 1763. In that pivotal year of 1759, British forces seized several crucial forts in the Ohio Territory, previously held by the French. On July 7, 1759, they laid siege to Fort Niagara, located near modern-day Youngstown, Ohio, with approximately 900 Iroquois warriors rallying under the command of Sir William Johnson. On July 20, tragedy struck when the commander of the British forces was killed in an accident, leaving Sir William Johnson to take command of the entire contingent. Just a few days later, on July 23, Johnson received intelligence that a French force was en route to reinforce Fort Niagara. The following day, the British, alongside their Iroquois allies, executed a surprise ambush on the French troops, decisively defeating them and forcing their surrender. With no prospects for reinforcements, the French commander, Captain Pierre Pouchot, capitulated to Johnson on July 26. The fall of Fort Niagara sent shockwaves through the tribes allied with the French, prompting them to reconsider their position. Many began to doubt the French's ability to win the war and sought to establish friendly relations with the British. Seizing this opportunity, the British aimed to win over the native tribes they had once fought against. In August, George Croghan convened conferences with tribal leaders to forge a new alliance, marking a significant shift in the balance of power in the region. In keeping with Native American traditions, George Croghan honored tribal leaders from the Delaware, Shawnee, Ottawa, Miami, and other tribes by sharing the peace pipe. Among them, Chief Oolami of the Ottawa boldly vowed that his people would never again wage war against the British. Croghan dedicated considerable time to nurturing relationships with these leaders, preparing them for the inevitable reality that British control over New France was on the horizon. At a conference held at Fort Pitt, approximately 1,000 representatives from the Western tribes made the journey to hear the British promises. They were reassured that their lands would not be taken and that trade would soon resume. This commitment was conveyed through a letter from General Jeffrey Amherst, the commander-in-chief of His Majesty's forces in North America. While the letter was being read at Fort Pitt, Amherst's forces were actively pushing the French back to Montreal. On September 8, 1760, the governor of New France, Pierre Rigaud de Vaudreuil, surrendered Montreal to the British. With the city under their control, the British effectively conquered New France, significantly expanding their territory in North America. Just days later, on September 12, Amherst dispatched Major Robert Rogers and 2 companies of rangers to the French forts across the frontier, tasked with receiving their surrender and raising the British flag. Croghan was also sent to meet with the indigenous peoples, informing them of the British victory and their new status as British subjects. He reiterated Amherst's message, promising that trade would resume and their lands would remain protected. The British further fostered goodwill by supplying the tribes with ammunition for their weapons. However, frustrations began to simmer among the indigenous tribes by the spring of 1761. As the trading season opened, they found themselves laden with furs but faced with British offerings of goods that held little interest for them, alongside strict limits on the rum they could trade. Many felt that the prices set by the British were exorbitant and unjust. In an effort to mend relations, Johnson provided Amherst with a list of sought-after trade items and negotiated better prices, particularly for tribes near Fort Detroit. While Amherst assured Johnson that he would strive to maintain peace with the tribes, he was concerned that the British were overindulging the indigenous peoples, mistaking their system of trade and gifts for bribery. Unlike Amherst, who failed to grasp the importance of hospitality, friendship, and respect in indigenous traditions, the French had understood this dynamic well. So did experienced figures like Johnson and Croghan. The issue of rum remained particularly contentious, further complicating relations between the British and the native tribes. The British cleverly leveraged rum to gain an edge in the fur trade while the French were still in the game. They made it easy for Native Americans to purchase rum, allowing them to buy as much as they wanted until supplies were depleted. This strategy helped the British outmaneuver the French. However, once the French were subdued, the British changed their approach, imposing restrictions on where and how much rum the native tribes could buy. To enforce these new policies, the British mandated that all trade be conducted at the forts, which angered the indigenous peoples. Previously, British traders had brought their goods and rum directly to the tribal camps and villages. Now, the tribes were forced to travel to the British forts for trade, creating significant inconvenience and resentment. The situation worsened when General Amherst awarded land near Niagara to some of his officers as a reward for their service during the conflict with the French. This decision infuriated the Seneca tribe, prompting them to carry a red wampum belt, a symbol of war, to rally other tribes in the east. The Seneca rallied other tribes to join them in declaring war on the British, proposing simultaneous attacks on British forts in Detroit, Pittsburgh, Presque Isle, Venango, and Niagara. They traveled to Detroit to convene a council with the Western tribes, presenting their ambitious plan for resistance. However, news of the plot quickly reached the commander of Fort Detroit, Captain Daniel Campbell. Alarmed, he dispatched letters to the commanders of the other forts to warn them of the impending threat. To gather intelligence, Campbell sent a French trader to spy on the Seneca's activities. This trader managed to infiltrate the council held by the Seneca on July 3, where chiefs Cayachita and Tahaidoras outlined their strategy. Despite the Seneca's grievances and call to arms, many local tribes hesitated to sever their ties with the British, showcasing their reluctance to abandon the existing alliances. After the council concluded, the local tribes informed the Seneca that they would provide their response the following day at Fort Detroit, in full view of Captain Campbell. When the day arrived, the local tribes presented the Seneca war belt to Campbell, a symbolic gesture that left the Seneca feeling embarrassed. In response, they voiced their grievances against the British, seeking to articulate their frustrations. However, Campbell dismissed their concerns, instructing them to cease their plotting and return to their homes in western New York, which they reluctantly did. Yet, the seeds of conflict had been sown. In May 1761, George Croghan and Sir William Johnson convened to address the growing discontent among the western tribes. Aware of the tribes' dissatisfaction with the new British policies, they aimed to find a resolution. This dialogue was followed by Amherst's journey to Albany to meet with Johnson. Together, they decided that Johnson and Croghan would travel to Detroit to hold a council with the leaders of the western tribes, hoping to mend relations and prevent further escalation. After leaving Albany, Amherst sent a letter to Sir William Johnson, dated August 9, instructing him to discontinue the practice of purchasing the goodwill of the Native Americans and to limit their access to ammunition. Amherst feared that all tribes, not just those in the West, might turn against the British and use the ammunition against them. In addition, Amherst decided that while Johnson was meeting with the Western tribes, an expedition would be launched to occupy key posts at Michilimackinac, Green Bay, St. Joseph, Sandusky, Miami, and Ouiatenon. Major Henry Gladwin was appointed to lead this expedition to the forts. Amherst directed Gladwin to assess each post and deploy as many troops as necessary, emphasizing the importance of following any recommendations from Johnson regarding relations with the tribes. On September 9, Johnson's council with the Western tribes commenced. He expressed his intention to strengthen the bond of friendship between the tribes and the British, aiming to restore trust and cooperation amidst the growing tensions. Johnson assured the tribal leaders that they would not be deprived of more land than necessary for conducting business or for which the British held a lawful claim. In accordance with Native American custom, the leaders took the time to deliberate and prepared their response for the following day. On September 10, they conveyed their support for Johnson and Amherst, pledging their loyalty to the British. In response, Johnson celebrated their alliance the next day by presenting the tribal leaders with gifts and hosting a feast that featured a roasted ox. After the council, Johnson meticulously drafted a comprehensive list of trade terms, sending it to the commanders of each post with clear instructions to maintain positive relations with all native tribes. He encouraged the commanders to stay in regular communication with one another and to utilize interpreters to ensure adherence to the agreed-upon terms of trade. In October, Johnson returned to his home in New York and wrote to Amherst, summarizing the outcomes of his recent engagements with the tribes and emphasizing the importance of their new alliance. Johnson expressed his confidence that he had successfully brokered a long-lasting peace and alliance with the Western tribes. During this period, however, Pontiac began to voice his opposition to British rule. He accused the British of changing the terms of trade and criticized their restrictions on access to rum. Pontiac was particularly alarmed when Captain Campbell, still in command at Detroit, learned that Amherst had halted the tradition of giving gifts and limited access to ammunition. In response, Campbell wrote to Bouquet at Fort Pitt, requesting permission to supply the tribes with ammunition, believing it might help prevent hostilities. Both Johnson and Croghan supported Campbell's approach, but Amherst remained steadfast in his policy of denying gifts and ammunition to the native tribes. For the time being, the Western tribes had departed for their winter hunts, ensuring a fragile peace. However, Campbell, Johnson, and Croghan were increasingly concerned about the potential for conflict when the tribes returned in the spring. Meanwhile, the British bolstered their military presence by garrisoning posts and forts throughout the frontier. When the Western tribes returned in the spring of 1762, they quickly discovered that their understanding of British policy was starkly different from that of General Amherst. The tribes sought rum and ammunition, both of which were in short supply. Adding to the tribes' concerns was the news that Spain had allied with France in the 7 Years' War against Britain, leading to Britain declaring war on Spain on January 2, 1762. Rumors circulated that the French and Spanish would send a combined force to reclaim Quebec and drive the British out of North America. At Fort Detroit, Captain Campbell attempted to mend relations by providing the tribes with more rum and gunpowder than authorized. On July 3, he wrote a letter to Bouquet, warning that if Amherst continued to refuse to offer gifts, including ammunition, to the Native Americans, it would only be a matter of time before an uprising occurred. Here's a revised version of your passage that enhances clarity and engagement while retaining the original content. The French seized the opportunity to spread rumors among the native tribes in both the West and East. They claimed that the British intended to eliminate the indigenous peoples, pointing to Amherst's restrictions on their access to ammunition as proof. In response to the changing landscape, Amherst dispatched expeditions to explore the newly acquired British territories to the south. He also directed Major Gladwin to take command at Fort Detroit, transferring Captain Campbell to Fort Sault Ste. Marie. Gladwin arrived at Fort Detroit on August 23, 1762. Not long after his arrival, unsettling rumors began to circulate that the indigenous tribes were conspiring against the British. On September 28, an Indian from the Detroit area visited George Croghan in Pennsylvania, sharing that he had heard about a secret council held in an Ottawa village. During this council, 2 Frenchmen spoke to leaders from the Ottawa, Chippewa, Huron, Potawatomi, and other tribes. Although the messenger did not know the specifics of what the French said, he reported that messengers had been dispatched to other tribes, heightening tensions further. Croghan received similar rumors from Iroquois men he knew, prompting him to send letters to Amherst and Johnson detailing what he had heard. In December, he discovered that earlier in the spring, the Shawnee had received a war belt and hatchet from the Wee tribe, a gift from the French. Alarmed, Croghan wrote to Johnson, warning that war with the indigenous tribes seemed imminent. Fortunately for the British, the tribes often struggled to work together, hampered by historical grievances and jealousy stemming from earlier conflicts. This disunity made it challenging for them to set aside their differences for a common cause. However, this dynamic began to shift when a Delaware named Nealon experienced a profound dream that inspired him to travel between villages sharing his vision. In his dream, Nealon encountered a being known as the Master of Life, who revealed to him that the land in the Ohio Valley, home to the Delaware tribe and others, was intended for indigenous peoples alone, not for outsiders. Nealon's message resonated deeply among the tribes, sowing the seeds of unity and resistance. Nealon, often referred to as the Delaware prophet or the impostor, captivated not only the indigenous tribes but also British and French settlers and traders who traveled to hear him preach his message in various villages. Much like the evangelists during the Great Awakening, Nealon spread a message of hope and salvation, advocating for the abandonment of vices. His teachings resonated throughout the Ohio Valley and among the Western tribes, including the Ottawa. The growing discontent with British policies, the lack of respect shown to native peoples, and Nealon's inspirational message created a platform for unity among the tribes. However, another pressing issue arose concerning land. As with many other situations involving indigenous peoples, the British failed to grasp how the tribes utilized the land. The indigenous populations were migratory, often following the animals they relied on for sustenance. Even if they did not occupy a specific region at a given time, they still considered it their territory and hunting grounds. This perspective was in stark contrast to the British view that land ownership was directly tied to occupancy. In the East, the situation was further complicated by the Iroquois belief that the British would ultimately push the French out and then retreat back to the eastern side of the Allegheny Mountains. However, not only did the British remain, but an increasing number of colonists crossed the mountains to settle on the frontier. In the spring of 1763, war belts began to circulate throughout the region known as the Pays du Nord, or the Upper Country. This area extended from the west of Lake Michigan to the east of Lake Ontario, near the Appalachian Mountains, starting at the northern tip of Michigan and stretching south past Fort Pitt into Illinois and Ohio. In the west, Pontiac claimed to have received war belts from the French, while the Seneca sent a belt, likely crafted by their chief, Chishuda. Encouraged by these developments, Pontiac began to advocate for war against the British, rallying support among the tribes. Pontiac's popularity surged, particularly among the local villages of the Ottawa, Ojibwe, and Potawatomi tribes. As his influence grew, he began to command warriors from various villages in the Detroit area, establishing himself as a key leader in the western portion of the conflict. The Hurons also allied with Pontiac, adding their strength to the coalition of tribes residing in the Great Lakes region. From the Illinois country, tribes such as the Miamis, Wees, Kickapoos, Mascoutins, and Pionkashaws joined Pontiac's cause. Meanwhile, the Delawares, Shawnees, Wyandots, and Mingos emerged from the Ohio country to lend their support. While it is conceivable that Pontiac was able to coordinate attacks across the entire region from east to west, or that Chishuda could do the same, such a level of organization is unlikely. It is far more plausible that the French encouraged indigenous peoples from New York to Michigan to rise up in a manner that created the appearance of a united front conducting coordinated attacks. The only Iroquois tribe involved in the uprising, and the sole tribe from outside the Pays du Nord, was the Seneca. The conflict began with a surprise assault on Fort Detroit on May 9, 1763, led by Pontiac, who commanded roughly 300 warriors. However, the plot was exposed, allowing the British to prepare for the impending attack. Pontiac laid siege to the fort, a standoff that would last until November. Similar assaults erupted throughout the Ohio country and western Pennsylvania during the spring and summer of 1763. In May, indigenous forces captured Fort Sandusky in the Ohio country, followed by the capture of Fort St. Joseph and Fort Miami. In June, a raiding party of Ottawa and Ojibwe warriors successfully took Fort Michilimackinac. On June 22, 1763, a contingent of Delaware warriors attacked Fort Pitt, resulting in the deaths of several British settlers. In July, a British expedition attempted to break free from the siege at Fort Detroit to retaliate against Pontiac's village. This led to the Battle of Bloody Run on July 31, 1763, which ended in heavy losses for the British. August brought the Battle of Bushy Run, where British forces under Colonel Henry Bouquet clashed with indigenous forces besieging Fort Pitt. The British managed to fend off the attackers and lift the siege on August 20. In September, indigenous forces launched an assault on a British supply train near Niagara Falls. Reinforcements were dispatched from Fort Niagara to support the supply train, but the British were soundly defeated by a coalition of warriors from the Seneca, Ojibwe, and Ottawa tribes. By the end of the fighting in 1763, the British had lost 8 key forts along the frontier, including critical positions at Presque Isle, Sandusky, and Michilimackinac. In October 1763, the British government decided to take political action to end the conflict. King George III issued the Proclamation of 1763, which prohibited colonists from settling west of the Appalachian Mountains. The lands beyond the mountains, which the indigenous peoples were fighting to retain, were designated as their hunting grounds. This proclamation was primarily aimed at restricting colonial expansion and minimizing the costs associated with defending the frontier. To bolster their defenses, Britain stationed approximately 5,000 troops west of the Appalachians to garrison the forts and protect the western frontier from potential attacks by the French and Spanish. In December 1763, tensions escalated when colonists living in the village of Paxton, located on the Pennsylvania frontier, conducted a raid on a settlement of the Conestoga tribe in Lancaster County. 6 Native Americans were killed, and 14 were taken prisoner, only to be murdered about. Despite the proclamation of 1763, indigenous tribes continued to raid colonial settlements on the frontier, extending their reach beyond the Pays d'en Haut, with attacks reported in Virginia and Maryland. Major Hearst was recalled to London in August 1763 and replaced by General Thomas Gage. Gage permitted William Johnson to negotiate a peace treaty with the tribes around Fort Niagara, including the Seneca. In the fall of 1764, the British launched 2 military expeditions against the indigenous tribes. One was led by Colonel John Bradstreet, while Colonel Bouquet commanded the other. The tribes found themselves at a disadvantage, without their French allies to supply them with ammunition, an arrangement that would violate the armistice between the French and the British. They were eventually forced to surrender. Bradstreet traveled to Fort Presque Isle, where he negotiated a treaty with the local tribes, despite only being authorized to establish a truce. The terms of the treaty negotiated by Bradstreet promised that Bouquet's expedition would not take place. However, Gage and other British leaders were outraged and had no intention of honoring the treaty. Unbeknownst to Bradstreet, he had overstepped his authority. He continued to Fort Detroit, where he negotiated a second treaty, but his treatment of the tribal leaders offended them. Bouquet departed from Fort Pitt on October 3 and marched into the Ohio country, where he successfully brokered an agreement with the tribes that ended hostilities and facilitated the return of captives to their families. In July 1765, tribes from the Ohio country convened with William Johnson to formalize a peace treaty. Although Pontiac refused to surrender and continued his resistance, his influence waned. He attempted to recruit tribes from farther west and south, but these efforts proved unsuccessful. By the fall of 1764, the rebellion had effectively ended. In July 1766, Pontiac met with William Johnson at Fort Ontario, where he ultimately agreed to peace. The signing of the Treaty of Oswego officially concluded the conflict, and Pontiac received a pardon for his involvement. Pontiac's rebellion initially gained traction, with American Indians capturing most British forts. However, they were never able to seize Fort Pitt or Fort Detroit, and the uprising against British rule gradually dissipated by the end of 1764. On that note, we conclude today's episode. Thank you for joining us once again. We hope you enjoyed this video. Remember to hit the subscribe button and turn on the notification bell so you'll be the first to see our new updates.